Well, good morning, everyone. It may be good afternoon or good evening where some of you are. I'm Darcy Winslow. I'm president of the Academy for Systems Change, and it does look like we have the planet represented on our list of attendees. So thank you very much. I'm really, really honored to host Adam Kahane today to share with us some of his wisdom and insights from his new book, Collaborating with the Enemy. We've been looking forward to this for many months now. So before we start, I'd like to give just a quick introduction. The Academy has been around for about 8 years now, and we work with leaders and leading organizations around the world to really build their capacity to be able to lead at the systems level around critical ecosystems, domains that we rely on to thrive in the world. And it's just been an honor to be a part of the Academy. Leanne Grillo is also a partner and co-founder in the Academy, and she'll be leading some of the questions with Adam today. So I'd like to first introduce Adam. Adam is one of the directors at Rios Partners, which is an international enterprise that has been designing and facilitating systemic change projects for well over 20 years. And Adam's work at Rios focuses on helping people work together to address the most important and difficult challenges they face. You probably read it in the book or one of his other books, but Adam's deep interest in the potential of collaboration started when, in 1991, he helped a team of South African leaders to think through how they would begin the transition from apartheid to democracy. And through that work, and Adam, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you quit your job at Shell, way to go, and you emigrated to Cape Town to work on collaboration as a way to address these complex challenges. You've worked in more than 50 countries, and I find this incredible. You've worked with executives, politicians, generals, guerrillas, civil servants, trade unionists, community activists, clergy. And I'm wondering who else is out there if I missed anybody. That's a pretty impressive list. Adam has learned through his work that collaboration is not as straightforward. We always talk about, we need to collaborate, but I think we'll hear new insights from Adam on how we really break through and begin to collaborate in a way that really, really makes a difference. So thank you, Adam, for joining us today. I look forward to it. Some of his other books, I've always loved your Power and Love book. Great, great book. Also, Adam's written Solving Tough Problems, An Open Way of Talking, Listening, and Creating New Realities, and also Transformative Scenario Planning. I believe that was your first. Another great book. So as I mentioned, Leanne is also one of the founders of the Academy, and she has been a partner in everything that we've done, designed, facilitated, hosted over the years. She's also the founder of Spaces for Change and is just a mistress at creating spaces where deep, deep conversation and change can happen. She works closely with the Sustainable Food Lab, which you'll hear a little bit more about, and has a deep connection to the Society for Organizational Learning's Education Partnership, and was also one of the co-founders of Rios Partners. So I'm going to stop there on the introductions because I would love to get into the meat of this. But first, let me just say a little bit about how this webinar is going to run. We are recording this, so we will share the recording with all of you within just a couple of days. Leanne's going to start with posing some questions to Adam, and then we'll open the conversation, the questions. You can see at the bottom of your screen, I think, is a Q&A box. You can type in your questions, and we'll be sorting through those and pulling out some of the questions that we'll also pose to Adam. If you have any technical questions, you can pose it in the Q&A or in the chat box. From Rios Partners is in the background. He'll be looking for any technical challenges you may have and answering those. And I believe that's it. We've got all your videos turned off. We've got your audio muted. So you'll have to rely on the Q&A box. And I believe that's it. So Leanne and Adam, over to you. Welcome.
Great. Thanks so much, Darcy. So Adam, I have to say, I've really enjoyed getting ready for this webinar because it's given me an excuse to sort of travel a little bit down memory lane from the first time we worked together on that project, the initial prototype, if you will, before we even called them social change labs or change labs back in 2002, to the Global Sustainable Food Lab, which you were a co-founder of, co-founding Rios Partners, and then most recently working on the Health Equity Scenario Project that we just finished up about the future of health equity in the United States. I was just thinking about how we've each changed ourselves through this work, as well as how the approach to the work has changed. And collaboration, has always been a centerpiece to the work. It's always been something that we thought was the way to address complex problems. But in collaborating with the enemy, you actually bring up 4 different options for how to move forward. That collaborating is one of them, but there's also forcing, adapting, and exiting. And so could you talk about these 4 options and how they might be used and when, and how a group might determine which is the best path to take?
Well, thanks, Leanne and Darcy and Che and Sarah in the background. I'm happy to be here and to talk with you all. And yes, Leanne, we have had lots of adventures together over the years. Yeah, the point you raise is, for me, one of the most important, certainly a revelation for me. I don't think it's possible to understand collaboration if you don't understand what the alternatives are. And I guess it's obvious, but this took me a long time to realize because, as you said, my own or our own professional orientation has been to support collaboration. But in a way, it's obvious we can't work with everybody on everything, and we can't not work with anybody on anything. So the question is, what are we going to collaborate on? And I don't know, I'm not sure the extent to which it's a group decision. It usually comes down to a decision for an individual or for an organization. Do we want to try to do this thing that we want to do on our own, or do we need to work with others? Maybe for some people, collaboration is the first option. Maybe for other people, it's the last resort. But for me, it's crucial to understand that when we're faced with a situation that we find unsatisfactory or unacceptable or problematic, we have some subset of the following 4 options. The first option is we can try to make things the way we want them to be. And I think for many people, I'm not going to say all people, but for many people, forcing is what they'd prefer to do if they could do it. Just have things be, use whatever power they have, their authority or their autonomy or their money or their votes or their weapons, whatever it is, to make things the way they want them to be. I remember when I started working on this book, I guess about 2 years ago now, a couple of people at Rios said, "Wow, a book on collaboration. That sounds great. Can I write it with you?" And my reaction was absolutely not. There's something I wanted to do, which is write this book. I had all kinds of ideas. For me, it was a creative and professional challenge, and I didn't need to work on it with anybody else until it got to the later stages of actually preparing it for publication. And so I did it myself. So this is what I mean by forcing. I want to do it. I'm going to do it my way. The problem with forcing, as everybody knows, is maybe not in cases like writing books, but in lots of other cases, I try to make it the way I want it to be, and people who want it to be otherwise push back, and we end up with pushing and pulling, or being stuck, or creating violence. The second option is things are not the way I want them to be. I can't make them the way I want them to be, so I adapt. I try to find a way to live with the situation as it is. And for me, it's crucial to understand that actually most of the time we adapt to most things. I'm in Winnipeg now. It's cold outside. There's nothing I can do about that, really. So I put on a coat, or I put on a scarf. And so I adapt to a situation that's not as I want it to be and that I can't influence. The third option is the situation's not as I want it to be. I can't live with it as it is, and so I exit. I either get a divorce, or I quit my job, or I emigrate. It can be liberating. It can be tragic. And so I understand collaboration as what you do instead of forcing, adapting, or exiting, or at least what you try to do. And in that context, we have to decide when do we want to or think we need to collaborate, and when is there another way to get where we're trying to go. But it's certainly not true that we have to collaborate about everything with everybody. That just doesn't make any sense.
Great, thanks. So back in the day, when we thought about building multi-stakeholder collaborations and coalitions that would collaborate to address a particular situation, we thought about it as conventional collaboration. And I think now what you're trying to talk about is a different form of collaboration. But in conventional collaboration, it was more like plan the work the plan, figure out the problem, the solution, and then how to get there. Can you talk a little bit now about stretch collaboration, which is really the focus of collaborating with the enemy, and give us some examples of when you've utilized it?
Yeah, this for me was one of the main discoveries in writing the book, is that the way we typically think about collaboration is you agree on the purpose, you agree on the problem, you agree on the solution, you agree on the plan, you agree on who needs to do what to execute the plan. And I think that's how most people think collaboration has to be. And what I've learned, I guess the hard way, is even if we want it to be like that, in most cases it can't be like that. For the simple reason, or let me say, in situations where we're not in control. So maybe if we're the boss, there's a kind of collaboration where we can define or force a definition of all those things: purpose, problem, solution, plan, roles. But in horizontal situations where nobody's got authority over anybody, which is the kind of collaboration that Rios is involved in almost always, even if we want it to be like that, it's not going to be like that. And so the idea of stretch collaboration is, what's the alternative? How do you collaborate when you're not in control, when the situation you're dealing with, where the actors you're dealing with are out of control or out of your control? And stretch collaboration is a way of working which assumes that for most of the time, people will have different understandings of the problem and the solution. They won't agree or know or agree what will be done beyond maybe the next step. And most fundamentally, they're going to do what they want to do, regardless of what you think they ought to do. I think I saw Valeria Scorza's name on the list. Hola, Valeria. We've been working together for 3 years in a very wonderful and interesting and important and difficult project that just went public last week called Mexico's Posibles, Possible Mexicos, which is a multi-stakeholder collaboration to deal with illegality, insecurity, and inequity, the whole mess, the mess in Mexico and in many other places as well. And the most fundamental thing about the 90 or so leaders involved in Mexico's Posibles is they're going to do what they want to do. None of them, I think with no exceptions, none of them have authority over any others. And that idea of how do we work together when we're different and where the situation and the work is not under control. One of the things that interested me in this Mexico's Posibles example is this team has, after 3 years, developed the capacity to do lots of things together. This is showing up in lots of ways, and it showed up very dramatically last September when these big earthquakes hit all over Mexico. And in the team chat, the WhatsApp chat of Mexico's Posibles, there was this very fluid willingness to work together to help. I've got 20 tons of roofing material. I'm on my way to Puebla. Does anybody know who I can meet there and deliver it to? And the thing that occurred to me about that remarkable example of real collaboration is the Mexico's Posible group probably doesn't agree on any more than they did 3 years ago. They still disagree, but in spite of disagreeing, in spite of not being under control, in spite of having some level of liking and trusting, but delimited, they're able to do lots of things together. And that's what interests me. How is it possible to collaborate in situations where we're not under control and where we don't necessarily agree with or like or trust the others? Because I think that type of situation is more and more common, not only in multi-stakeholder contexts like the Food Lab or like Mexico's Posible, but in many contexts, families, organizations, cities, where more people have voice and fewer situations are under control of bosses and authorities and parental figures, etc. In fact, one of the things that I think was problematic in the Food Lab, at least at the time the two of us worked on it, maybe it's changed since then, is there was this assumption, okay, we have some ideas about things to do, let's execute them as we would in our own organizations in a very controlled manner. And at least during the time I was involved, that part of it didn't work. That you couldn't execute multi-stakeholder collaborations the way you could things within your own organization where there's a clear line of authority.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah. So could you, I was actually going to ask you about the Food Lab a little bit and any other reflections that, now 15 years later, and with this model of stretched collaboration in mind, what would you have done differently with the Food Lab now? And if you could just also give a couple of words of description about the Food Lab, that would be great as well.
Well, I think the Food Lab has been a great accomplishment, and I'm proud to have been involved and to be able to work with you and Hal and Dawn and others. The Food Lab is a platform with people from food companies and NGOs and academics and farmer organizations and government and regulatory organizations that's working on developing sustainable food supply chains. And I was involved only for the first few years, so to some extent what I'm going to say may be out of date, but I think there are some important lessons. The Food Lab for me is a remarkable remarkably successful example of multi-stakeholder collaboration. And one of the things I remember about it, which I wrote about in this new book, is in the, whatever it was, 4 or 5 months of convening that Hal Hamilton and I did, I remember 3 specific occasions where individuals we approached or organizations we approached chose not to join. And I mention that in my new book because I think their choice that it would be better to do things on their own, to force, in my vocabulary, to try to make things the way they wanted them to be using the power they had, in different cases, corporate power, government power, and mass mobilization power, in retrospect is very instructive. Why do people choose not to collaborate? The second thing that stands out for me about that experience, which I now think of is very important, is the idea that we might have some thoughts about what we ought to do, in this case, what we ought to do to create more sustainable food supply chains, but actually we don't know what's going to work or not work. And we can spend 2 months locked in a room and we're still not going to know until we try it. And I think one of the things that's been successful about the Food Lab, partly because of this approach, which is second nature in agriculture, that things are not under your control. You're going to do what you think you can do, and you're going to pay attention if it works, and if it doesn't work, you're going to plow it under and start again. So this idea that we advance through trial and error, which for many people is too terrifying to contemplate, has been the way the Food Lab has moved. And I make quite a big point of this, as the experimenting a way forward is one of the 3 central tenets of stretch collaboration. And the third learning, which is the one I mentioned 5 minutes ago, is if there was one thing I would have done differently, and maybe you have done it differently since the time I was involved, I think at the time we assumed that, okay, we have an idea about what to do, now we can do it the way we do everything else. And in other words, with conventional collaboration, let's agree on the purpose, the problem, the solution, the plan, and who needs to do what. And in general, that doesn't work in situations which are out of control. So in a way, the paradoxical thing is I'm lowering the bar to collaboration. I'm actually saying it's possible to collaborate even when we can't agree, or can't agree for long, on purpose, problem, solution, plan, and roles. We have to, because those situations are almost never present, and we can. So it's not as impossible as it sounds, but it's not going to look like the sort of working together that we might be used to. I'm from Montreal, and there aren't a lot of famous management professors from Montreal, but one of them is Henry Mintzberg. And Mintzberg's claim to fame, or one of his claims to fame, is as a researcher, as a management researcher, noticing what managers really do compared to what they think they're supposed to do, or what they were taught in school they're supposed to do. And I think this is a very good example of this. Stretch collaboration is what collaboration really looks like, not what we think it's supposed to look like. And that for me is a relief, that it doesn't have to be this impossible hill of needing to get this sequence of agreements, which in most important cases we can't get.
Thank you. Yeah. One of the things that came up in one of our Academy Fellows gathering just recently was a question around, if I'm working in this one part of the system, am I really having a systemic impact? Am I really able to make a larger difference? And in the book, you talk about wholes, parts, and holons. And you talk about it's often hard to figure out where our energy should be focused. And a lot of times we're talking about a holographic image around this work, that the whole is actually in the parts. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this parts and holons concept that you bring forward in the book.
Well, let me talk about it, but second, the first thing I want to say is this question you asked is something that confused me for a long time. And the way I think about it now is, in general, we can't act on the whole system. And so the way I now think about it is acting systemically means doing whatever we're doing in whatever part of the system we want to and are able to work in with an awareness of the whole. But that's for me the answer to the riddle. What does it mean to act systemically? Now, this word holon is a very ordinary word. It's amazing to me that it's not well known. It's a word that was coined or became known because of a book written in the 1950s by Arthur Koestler. And a holon is just a whole that is part of a larger whole. So I'm a whole in myself, and you're a whole in yourself. We have boundaries, histories, interests, needs, and at the moment, the two of us, we're both part of a whole of this conversation, and the two of us are part of a larger whole of everybody on this call, and I'm also part of the whole of everybody who's in this hotel in Winnipeg now, etc. So for me, this very straightforward idea is important for the basic reason that when somebody says, let's focus on the whole, or could you put your parochial interest aside and focus on the whole, I've come to think that this is always a nonsensical and usually manipulative request. There's no such thing as the whole. I mean, except in some cosmic sense. What's the whole? Is it everybody on this call? Is it, I mean, there are many wholes always. And to recognize this ordinary fact is to recognize that there's always multiple wholes. They always have some things in common and some things different. And that's what collaboration involves. And when somebody says, let's focus on the whole, what they almost always mean is, let's focus on the whole that I care about. I realized some years ago that in the type of workshop that you and I do, when there's a group of stakeholders in the room, there's really only one or maybe two people for whom the good of the group as a whole and their own benefit are identical. And those two people are the facilitator and maybe the boss. For everybody else, yes, there's the whole of the group, but there's also their own department, their own organization, their own family. And so to say, let's focus on the whole, in that sense, is a manipulative thing that bosses and facilitators say that doesn't have any real meaning, and it obscures the basic reason why collaboration is challenging. Is there's always multiple wholes, period. And so there's no way around the need to attend to that and to be willing to work with conflict as well as connection.
Great. Leanne, could I jump in here with some of the questions
Sure.
from the participants? And thank you all. Questions are starting to come in, so please continue to send them. Adam, I'm going to start with a relatively simple one that just came in. And they ask, what are the most important skills, 1 to 3 skills, you need to collaborate with, quote, the enemy?
In the book, I suggest 3 practices or skills. So let me say those, and then I think there might be more to say. But The first is the one I just mentioned a minute ago, which is to attend to and work with not only connection or wholeness, but also with conflict and difference and separateness. So that's one. The second is one I mentioned 10 minutes ago, which is experiment a way forward. Realize that we're almost never able to know, or even if we did know, get agreement on what everything that ought to be done is. So take a step and see what happens, and then take another step. And the third, which I haven't mentioned, but I consider to be the most fundamental, is to recognize that in most cases you are or need to consider or need to understand yourself as part of the situation rather than apart from the situation. And rather than focusing on what other people ought to be doing, which is how many of us spend a lot of our time, the third practice is, yeah, you might notice what other people are doing, but in the end, literally the only thing that matters is, what am I going to do next? And that practice of coming back to, okay, yeah, this is all happening, and what am I going to do next? That's the third practice. And for me, is fundamental, but also very difficult, because in this framing of the enemy, the typical starting point is those other people and what they need to do different. I was involved years ago, or 10 years ago to be exact, in a huge and very complicated and difficult project in India on child malnutrition, 60 stakeholders. And at one point I became overwhelmed with the confusion and complexity of the work. And I asked a mentor of mine, Arun Maira, I said, what are we really doing here, Arun? And he said, Adam, here's what we're really doing. Typically when a group of stakeholders get together, 100% of them start with the assumption that if only those other people would change what they're doing, things would be better. But if we're all here, mathematically, it's not possible. It's all about those other people. What we're really doing is helping people understand what they themselves need to do differently. And it's interesting, this is a big point in the book, and also in the conclusion of the book, which is a series of exercises. And so for the last few months, I've been asking people this question. What is different from you in thinking of yourself as outside or above on the one hand, versus inside and part of on the other hand? Mm-hmm. And people have two very interesting answers. The first answer is, oh, this is a lot. I feel a lot of responsibility now, and it's kind of challenging or even discouraging to realize that I'm part of the problem. But the second answer, which is always stronger, is, and now I have agency. Now I can do something, because it's about what I'm going to do next rather than what those people ought to be doing next. So for me, that third practice, or that third skill, or the third stretch, is the most fundamental.
That's great. Questions are just pouring in. So I'm going to say right up front, I don't think we're going to get to all of them. So here's another good juicy one. Don't you think that you can talk about impacting the whole when you co-create a shared view of the whole you all desire to impact? Isn't that even required to do the work?
Yeah, I guess so. With the caveat that there's no such thing as the whole, but yes, the whole or a whole that you're choosing to focus on. But no, I don't think it's required to have a shared vision of the whole. It would be nice. It would certainly be helpful. But often, or I would say at least in my work, most of the time, there is no agreement on the way things ought to be, or even on the way things are now. All there is, at best, there's agreement that the current situation is problematic, although perhaps problematic in different reasons and for different people, and that in order to work on it, we can't only work separately. That's all you need. You don't need agreement on the vision or the solution or even on the problem. And this is what I was mentioning 10 minutes ago. All these things that we think are essential, these agreements we think are required, but are or often difficult or impossible to get, turn out not to be necessary. The Mexico's Posibles, just to return to that example, that group has sort of a general idea of the way they'd like things to be: more equality, more security, more legality. But there's many things they don't agree on, and to repeat what I said earlier, and there's lots of things they can do together and that they can do separately, but with a greater sense of connection. So no, I think the most important thing I'm saying is it is not necessary to have agreement on the vision or on a bunch of other things that we think we need agreement on.
Great, thank you. I'll ask one more and then Leanne, over to you. This is a reflective question. I always love these kinds of questions. What are the most counterintuitive or surprising things that you, Adam, have learned while embarking on this work?
How much I'd prefer to just have things be the way I want them to be, and that lots of times that's okay. It's not illegal or immoral or even ineffective, but this idea that forcing is in many cases a legitimate and practical option. So that surprised me. I think the other thing is to notice in myself how strong this tendency is to start with what other people ought to be doing. I realized during the time I was writing the book that I could easily spend 2 or 3 hours every day thinking about what those other people ought to be doing. You know, my kids, my clients, my damn colleagues, Mr. Trump. And in a way, it's sort of soothing to spend your time thinking about what other people ought to be doing. But really, in the end, it is a complete waste of time. The only thing that matters is, okay, what am I going to do next? And I judge my development or my advancement, if you want that word, or my progress in the fact that I can usually get the amount of time I spend distracted by what other people are doing down from a few weeks to a few hours. I still do it, but I can catch myself a bit faster. In a really difficult case, a week. Oh yeah, I've just spent the week thinking about what that person ought to be doing. Okay, now let's go back to what am I going to do next? It's the only thing that matters. Literally, it's the only thing that matters. And so this idea that the enemy, I'm not saying that we never have enemies. Sometimes there are people out to get us, but I would say less frequently than most of us believe.
Great. So Adam, I'm just reflecting on one of the things that I absolutely love about your writing is your integration of stories and examples and how they really bring those concepts that you're talking about to life. So I'm just sort of really being re-energized by that. Here's another question that somebody's asked. In multi-stakeholder situations, you mentioned the need to experiment when a solution with whether a solution will work. If an experiment fails and people start to doubt the process, how do you get the stakeholders to come back and stay in the game, to keep trying it again?
It's a good question, but let me pick on the wording, at least the way you reported it, because in question and answer periods around this book, a phrase that people almost always use is the phrase you just used: how do we get people to ... And
Yep.
for me, without not being pedantic just for its own sake, I'm being pedantic for what I consider to be an important reason. You can never get anybody to do anything, at least if I reflect on my family, that's a true statement, let alone my colleagues, let alone the wider world. So I think it's important to check ourselves whenever we start a sentence with the words, how can we get people to? So you almost never can get people to. Okay, but leaving that aside, the way I've been dealing with this lately is to be very explicit up front that we're going to be using a process of experimentation, of learning by doing, of trying stuff out, trying to fail early and fail forward, to use some of the expressions around experimentation and rapid cycle prototyping. Because if people don't expect it, they will get discouraged or worse. We had a terrible problem in the first meeting of the Make Us Possible, using again an example of this, where things did not go as we had expected them to. So the agenda, what was happening in the group, did not go according to the plan. And we adjusted and did something differently. And I was very proud of the fact that we had made an adjustment and learned and tried something else which worked much better. But for some of the participants, this was a terrible mistake, that this was improvising. This was not following the plan. So of course, or not, maybe not of course, but at least for me, it'd be nice if things followed the plan. I like having things follow the plan. The problem is, normally they don't, or most of the time they don't. Most of the time, we just have to take a step and see what happens and adjust and take the next step. So it comes back to this very fundamental point that even if we want things to be under control, usually they're not. And the sooner we can realize that reality, the sooner we can get with the program. So for me, experimentation or emergence or learning by doing or feeling your way forward is the only way to deal with the way the world is most of the time, which is not under control, even if you wish it was.
Great.
These are rich questions. Do you want me to throw them out, Leanne?
Sure.
So you've touched on this, but Rachel poses this question in a slightly different way. How do you turn a forced or controlled situation into a stretch collaboration? Do you have to become a forcing force?
I think I understand the question, because there's the following situation happens very often, and it also happens at the beginning. And so the question, at least the way I understand it, is a very important and frequently asked question, which is, what happens if I want to collaborate with Frank, but Frank wants to just do it his way? This happens often. And so what do you do in that situation? I think there'd be two ways to answer that question. One is the one that Rachel alludes to, which is I have to use my force so that Frank realizes that he can't have things the way he wants them to be unilaterally, and therefore he must engage and collaborate with me. So that would be one answer. And that's the the common and perfectly reasonable use of demonstrations and boycotts and all kinds of other ways to get people to come to the table. But the other way is let me really make an effort to understand what's going on for Frank here. And is there a way in which Frank may understand the situation differently than I do, may not want to work with me, may not think the problem is what I think the problem is, but that there's a way in which the situation is problematic for Frank as well. And if I can make what might be a very challenging effort to see things through Frank's eyes, I might understand how would this collaboration make sense to him. Sorry, in this sentence, Frank is a fictitious person. I'm not thinking of a particular Frank if there's one on the line. But so, and I mention the second one because often it's not thought of. It's that Frank is wrong, Frank doesn't understand, Frank's needs to be forced. But often, it's very important to understand that most of these situations are not problems that have solutions. They're problematic situations that different actors find problematic for different reasons. This was a huge thing in the origin of the Sustainable Food Lab. For some people, the problem, for many of the NGOs, for example, the problem had to do with the terrible social disparities in agriculture. Other people were worried about environmental questions. Some of the food companies were worried about security of supply or consumer backlash. They all thought the situation was problematic, but in very different ways. And it always interested me that at least for the first few years I was involved in the Sustainable Food Lab, maybe it's changed since then, we knew that it wasn't worth trying to define the word sustainable, that this would just be a distraction. And we didn't need to. There were lots and lots of things that we wanted to do together, or different subsets of us wanted to do together, that didn't require us to agree on these definitions. And this is often the case.
So Adam, in the book, you've talked a lot about conventional collaboration. You've identified some of the pitfalls of it. Have you discovered any pitfalls around stretch collaboration? And if so, what are they?
Well, let me back up a bit. The reason the book's called Collaborating with the Enemy, which some people think is a wonderful title and some people think is a terrible title, is that the word collaboration in English and many other languages actually has two meanings. The one meaning is simply to work together with, the ordinary meaning of the word. But in many contexts, to be a collaborator is the worst thing you could possibly do. It means to betray, to work with the enemy in a way where you're a traitor. And I argue that this double sense of collaboration, that on the one hand, we think we need to work with these people in order to get where we're trying to go. And on the other hand, we worry about that to work with these people would require us to become traitors. That this double meaning is not a marginal matter. This is the very core of the difficulty of collaboration. And this is why collaboration is quite unstable. Often people say, well, let's try to work together, but it doesn't work out. So we try to work unilaterally, or it goes back and forth, or it goes along in a very unproductive way. So the basic challenge with all collaboration that stretch collaboration doesn't magically remove is we don't want to work with those people. We think to do so would be to abandon our principles. This is a central difficulty and requires us to to think in every situation and at every moment, is it worth it? Is there another way to get where I want to go? So I would say that's a big tension, and therefore, for that reason and many other reasons, collaboration, stretch collaboration, conventional collaboration often fails. It's a hard way to get things done. There's a reason why hierarchy and control and authority are the go-to methods for organizing work. Rios Partners is organized on balance as a hierarchy. Most organizations are because horizontal collaboration is a hard way to get things done and often fails. And so what I would say is do it when you need to do it and don't do it when you don't need to do it. And this is a very frequent symptom of horizontal multi-stakeholder collaborations, is actually nothing gets done. So that's the way in which those are the two typical ways it fails. Either I really don't want to work with these people, or no, actually we're not getting anything done, so I'm just going to do it with my friends or my colleagues or my subordinates.
Mm.
Maybe that doesn't show up in the academy. Maybe in the academy it works fine. I don't know.
Well, let me pose maybe one more question, and I'm going to put a couple of related questions together. Somebody writes in, enemies typically have very different agendas, and at times not including the enemy into the process makes it difficult to really achieve any progress. How do we handle these kinds of situations when you need to have the enemy to be part of the process? And the add-on question is, if you reach a point where you feel like exiting is your only option, it really feels like a lose-lose. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah. So I think we're now coming to the center of the what makes the work not straightforward and not easy and often not successful. In my original formulation, I didn't have exiting as an option, and people pointed out right at the beginning in the writing process that I was missing something important. And we know what exiting looks like. It looks like divorce or quitting or moving away. So yeah, it can be. It doesn't have to be a terrible thing, but it can be a terrible thing. It can mean, yeah, a loss or a pain, or at a minimum a painful transition. Or it can mean liberation and not being constrained by having to work with those people or that person. So yes, I think the double side of exiting is important. I would say two things about the first question about enemies having different agendas. First of all, I think it's helpful to understand that everybody, or I think the following sentence might only be a slight exaggeration. Everybody always has different agendas. So let's just start with that. You and I, Darcy, we're in different organizations. There's different things we need to do today. Yes, we have a common agenda for this 1 hour, but I don't know what you're doing the rest of the time, and I might or might not find it interesting or important or want to support you in it. That's fine. And that's normal that we would have with everybody. We would have some things in common and many things that are different. And so another way to say what this whole book is about how do you work with diverse others, which I think is an important challenge in a world where people are overall more able to be who they want to be. So in a way, diversity is increasing because there's more scope for people to do it the way they want to do it. I'm now speaking very generally. I guess the other thing, and maybe this is my last point for out of time, is that I'm using the word enemy in a bit of a mischievous way in the book. I'm using it as the starting point that very often the way people experience these situations is they have to work with those people that they don't want to. And they see those others as their enemies. I see those others as their enemies. It seems to me they're trying to undermine or sabotage or interfere with me. And as I said 15 minutes ago, sometimes that's the case, but actually not as often as we imagine it to be. And the final point of the book is, and I quote a lovely writer about Tai Chi, Wolf Lowenthal, who says that the purpose of practicing with an opponent, or in this case, I would say somebody you think of as your enemy, is it actually forces you to notice where you yourself are stuck. Now, that's not easy and often not comfortable or not fun, but I think it's really worthwhile and really useful. So that's where I am.
That's great, Adam. Thank you so much. And I don't know if you could see the questions, but we could literally be on till this time tomorrow. So I want to thank everybody for your questions. We're going to try and capture all those. And a couple of folks have asked if this was recorded. Yes, it was recorded, and we will share the recording with you. Please feel free to share it with your colleagues as well. The Academy, we will be hosting additional webinars. So Adam was the first one to kick it off. So thank you again, Adam, for your time and your wisdom and your experience. And if you would like to learn more about upcoming events through Rios Partners and what Adam's doing, you can visit their website, riospartners.com. You can also visit the Academy's website, academyforchange.org, and we'll continue to publicize other offerings that we'll have either in webinar or in person or learning hives, etc. So thank you all very much, and have a wonderful day. Go collaborate.
Or not. Thanks, Darcy.
Thanks, Adam.
You all.
Thanks.